Hey everyone, thanks for listening to the Red Haired Stokey podcast. I think we're on season 2, episode 4, and I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone that's supported this podcast so far, and my website and the videos that I make. Make sure that you head over to the website, which is theredhairedstokey.co.uk, and sign up for my free newsletter, and make sure that you don't miss anything that I do. So today we're going to be talking about the terrifying tale of Thomas Meakin, who was buried alive in Staffordshire. This is a chilling local story in North Staffordshire that tells of Thomas Meakin, a young man who was allegedly buried alive in 1781. The story spans the quiet village of Rushton Spencer and the bustling canal town of Stone, involving an apothecary's household, a mysterious illness, and a faithful pony that would not leave its master's grave. Over 2 centuries later, Thomas Meakin's grave can still be found at St Lawrence's Church in Rushton Spencer, a site that holds clues to the truth behind the tale. We're going to examine the legend and the historical evidence, and separate the fact from fiction about the boy who was buried twice. Thomas Meakin was born around 1760 in Rushton Spencer. He was the son of Thomas and Mary Meakin, a local family in this rural part of North Staffordshire. Rushton Spencer at the time was a small farming community, historically a chapelry of Leek Parish. Life here was typical of a country village in the 18th century, centred on agriculture and local trades. However, the wider region was beginning to offer new opportunities. Nearby, Macclesfield in Cheshire had developed a flourishing button making and silk industry by the mid-1700s, which had created jobs for peddlers and mill workers. Ambitious young people in villages like Rushton Spencer might look to these trades or to service in wealthier households as a way to improve their prospects. One notable feature of Rushton Spencer is its old church, St Lawrence's, perched on a hilltop outside the village. This medieval chapel of ease earned the nickname Chapel in the Wilderness for its solitary location amid fields and woods. Even by the late 18th century, the church stood a mile from the main settlement, a picturesque yet isolated spot, and the building itself was unique, originally timber-framed in the 13th or 14th century, and later encased in stone in the late 1600s. Villagers like the Meakin family would have climbed the hill to St Lawrence's for services, passing ancient yew trees and weathered gravestones, but little did they know that one day Thomas's own grave would lie there, under those yews, forever linked to a grim story. In around 1780, when Thomas Meakin reached his late teens, he left his quiet village for the town of Stone, about 16 miles to the south. He'd secured a position as a groom, or a stable hand, in the service of a local apothecary, which was a kind of an early pharmacist. For Thomas, who was known to be good with horses, this job was a chance for a better life. Entering service in a gentleman's household was considered a respectable step up for a young man of modest background in the 18th century. The move also suggests that Thomas may have had connections in Stone. Local research discovered the marriage of a Mary Meakin in Stone in 1742, and a burial of an Alice Meakin there in 1757, hinting that extended family from Rushton had settled in Stone decades earlier, and such family ties could have well helped Thomas find employment in the town. For Thomas, Stone must have felt like a bustling metropolis compared to Rushton Spencer. By 1801, Stone's population was recorded at about 2,843 people, which was about 20 times the population of Rushton Spencer. The town sat on the recently opened Trent and Mersey Canal, which brought commerce and travellers, and it was known for its brewing industry and coaching inns. In the late 1700s, Stone's economy thrived on beer brewing, which was a trade present since the Middle Ages, and hospitality for canal boatmen and coach travellers and market trade. A young man like Thomas would have found Stone energetic and full of opportunity. Serving a wealthy apothecary, likely one of the most prominent figures in town, gave Thomas a respectable position, a place to live, and daily work caring for horses. By all accounts, and according to later legend, Thomas proved popular and high-spirited in Stone, adapting well to his new life. To better understand Thomas Meakin's story, It's important to know what an apothecary was in the 1700s. In that era before modern regulations, apothecaries were medical generalists who filled the gap between physicians and surgeons. They compounded and sold medicines, often from a shop filled with colourful jars, and also provided basic medical advice and treatment to the public. An apothecary might treat everything from minor ailments to chronic illnesses among the middle and working classes. In provincial towns like Stone, the apothecary was a key figure in the community, a trained chemist, healer, and businessman all in one. Apothecaries enjoyed significant social standing and could become quite prosperous through their trade. In fact, they were often considered gentlemen. Many left substantial estates, and their wills have become a subject of historical study. Before the first medical register was published in 1779, there was little formal oversight of medical practice in England. This meant that apothecaries operated with a great deal of autonomy. They sometimes held contracts as dispensers for institutions like poorhouses and workhouses, where they effectively acted as resident doctors. With the knowledge of various compounds, an apothecary had access to all sorts of potions, some to heal and some that could harm. Deadly substances like arsenic were readily obtainable and used in remedies. Arsenic was a common ingredient in medicine for ailments such as syphilis. It's no surprise, then, that later gossip pointed a finger at the apothecary in Thomas's case. He was one of the few people with the means, knowledge, and authority to perpetrate a murder and cover it up. According to the legend, while working in Stone, Thomas caught the eye of his master's daughter. We do not know her name, and the historical record is silent on any romance, but local lore imagines a budding affection between the young groom and the apothecary's daughter. And one can easily paint the scenario. Thomas was around 20 years old, probably confident and capable, a newcomer with rustic charm, and she was a young lady in a comfortable household who enjoyed riding, so their paths would have crossed in the stables. Whether or not Thomas returned her affections, the mere perception of a romance could have been enough to alarm a protective father, and by the summer of 1781, tragedy struck. Thomas Meakin fell suddenly ill and died, just 21 years old. He was buried on the 16th of July 1781 at St Michael's Church in Stone. The burial register for St Michael's duly records Thomas's interment on that date. In an age before advanced diagnostics, his death may have been attributed to any number of causes: fever, a seizure, or another acute illness. Notably, there was no coroner's inquest into the death. At that time, inquests were not automatic unless there was clear signs of foul play or the deceased was unknown. In Thomas's case, his employer, the apothecary, would have been the very person attending him in his final hours, and likely the one to certify the death. As a respected local practitioner, the apothecary's word would have carried weight, and there may have appeared to be nothing amiss. To the townsfolk of Stone, the sad demise of a young servant could have been seen as natural, if unfortunate, event. Yet whispers must have started almost immediately. Perhaps someone noticed that Thomas's death was alarmingly sudden. Perhaps servants in the household exchanged uneasy glances at how quickly the burial was carried out. The apothecary, if he did disapprove of Thomas's closeness with his daughter, had a clear motive to remove the young man from the picture. And these suspicions were the seeds of what came next, a series of strange events that will make Thomas Meakin's fate the stuff of legends. The legend's most poignant detail is the behaviour of Thomas's pony. It's said that the loyal animal repeatedly found its way to Thomas's grave in Stone and began pawing at the earth. Time and again the pony returned at night to the burial spot, as if sensing its master was not at rest, and this eerie occurrence sparked alarm among Thomas's friends and onlookers at Stone. A year passed, and the rumours did not die down, and finally, nearly 12 months after his funeral, Thomas's friends, or, according to some versions, his family, decided to take action. They petitioned to have his grave opened to see if something was amiss, and in July 1782, Thomas Meakin's coffin was exhumed from the churchyard of St Michael's in Stone, and what the exhumation revealed confirmed everyone's worst fears. Inside the coffin, Thomas's body was found face down and contorted. Scratch marks were reportedly visible on the inside of the coffin lid. These signs indicated that Thomas had regained consciousness after burial and desperately tried to claw his way out. In other words, he'd been buried alive. And you can only imagine the horror of that moment for the people who opened the coffin, a realisation that their friend did not die when everyone assumed that he had. The likely explanation was that Thomas had been given, deliberately or accidentally, a powerful narcotic or poison that had induced a death-like coma. And in the 18th century, there were no reliable methods to tell if a person in a deep coma was truly dead. As the tale circulated later on, people drew parallels to the story of Romeo and Juliet, where Juliet takes an elixir that mimics death. In Thomas's case, if a toxic substance was used, arsenic is often suggested. Arsenic trioxide is tasteless and was a known poison at the time, and a dose might render a victim immobile and insensible without immediate death. The apothecary would have had such poisons at hand and the knowledge to administer them. Crucially, he would also have been trusted to declare Thomas dead without arousing suspicion. Following the exhumation, Thomas's remains were not reburied in Stone. His family intervened to reclaim their son. The parish register of Stone contains a terse but telling entry. Thomas Meakin of Stone was buried 16th of July 1781 and was removed thence and buried at Rushton Spencer, July 17th, 1782. This one-line official record confirms that Thomas's body was indeed exhumed and reinterred in Rushton Spencer a year after his first burial. It gives no further explanation, because none was legally required, but the timing aligns perfectly with the legend's events. Interestingly, there was no public scandal recorded in the local press or court records, and the absence of any surviving newspaper articles or trial documents suggests that whatever happened was handled quietly. No charges were ever brought against the apothecary or anyone else in relation to Thomas's death. Perhaps the community, lacking hard proof of a crime and facing the word of an esteemed gentleman, chose to let the matter drop. In Georgian England, without eyewitnesses or advanced forensics, the cause of a death like poisoning would have been extremely hard to prove, so the tragedy concluded with an uneasy silence, officially at least. Thomas's grieving parents saw to it that he was finally laid to rest in home soil. On the 17th of July 1782, 1 year and a day after he was first buried, Thomas Meakin was interred again, this time in St. Lawrence's churchyard, Rushton Spencer. This little hilltop church that he knew in life became his permanent resting place in death. Local law holds that the villagers took precautions with this reburial, given the disturbing circumstances. It's believed that if someone had died an unnatural or restless death, burying them in an unusual orientation could prevent the spirit from wandering. And in Christian tradition, most graves and the bodies within are pointing eastwards towards the sunrise, which is symbolic of the resurrection. Thomas's grave, however, was deliberately set facing west, the opposite direction. This west-facing orientation was highly unusual. In fact, Thomas's headstone is the only one in St. Lawrence's churchyard that faces west instead of east. And by burying him backwards, so to speak, the community may have hoped to lay his troubled soul to rest and thwart any ghostly unrest. It was a superstitious gesture born of genuine fear and sorrow. Thomas's new grave was placed in the north part of the churchyard, beneath the shade of ancient yew trees. In many Old English churchyards, the north side was traditionally the least desirable spot, often reserved for unbaptised infants or outsiders, because it lay in the shadow of the church. Whether by necessity or design, Thomas's reburial in the north underscores that his death was viewed as something out of the ordinary. Nevertheless, you can imagine that the reinterment was done with care and reverence. The chapel in the wilderness would have been quiet as a small funeral service was held for Thomas in 1782. His family and friends had finally got the chance to say proper goodbyes, and Thomas was returned to the green hills of his boyhood, far from the unhappy events in Stone. Despite the eerie legend surrounding it, Thomas Meakin's grave still physically exists and can be visited to this day in Rushton Spencer. The headstone, which is now over 240 years old, is weathered, but you can still read the inscription. It has a carved border, and at the very top has the word Memento Mori, This is a Latin phrase popular on 18th century gravestones, which means, remember that you must die, a reminder of mortality to all who pass by it. Below that, the stone is inscribed with Thomas's details. Thomas, son of Thomas and Mary Meakin, interred July 16, 1781, aged 21 years. The surname is spelt slightly different, so instead of Meakin, it's spelt Meaykin, which reflects an older or regional variation, but it is undoubtedly the same Thomas. The inscription confirms his age and the date of his initial burial in stone. But what truly sets this epitaph apart are the next lines. The stone reads, "As a man falleth before wicked men, so fall I." And this line is a poignant statement, essentially accusing unnamed wicked men of causing Thomas's downfall. And it echoes a biblical reference in Samuel 3:34, where King David laments a murder by saying, "As a man falleth before wicked men, so fallest thou." By choosing this epitaph, Thomas's friends or family made a bold suggestion that he was an innocent victim who met his end through foul play, a direct allusion to the belief that the apothecary murdered him. The final flourish on the gravestone is the phrase "Fear Thanatos." These two words are Greek, which translate to violent death or death by force. Now, it's highly unusual to see Greek on a village headstone, and this literally means violent death, which again underscores that Thomas's demise was unnatural. Combined with the memento mori at the top, the Latin and the Greek together impart a stark warning and story. Remember death, because it might come by violence, as it did to this young man. In an era when most tombstones simply listed names and dates with perhaps a comforting Bible verse, the Meakin gravestone stands out as a deliberate indictment and a narrative in itself. It immortalises the legend on stone. Anyone reading it learns that Thomas died at 21, and that his death was not a simple act of God. It was something much darker. St. Lawrence's Church in Rushton Spencer, where Thomas's grave is, deserves a moment of attention, not only for its scenic beauty, but also for its long history. As mentioned, the church had the nickname Chapel in the Wilderness since at least the 17th century, due to its lonely position on the hilltop. Even in modern times, visitors describe the trek to it as a hike into solitude. One writer noted that after a considerable walk, the little 13th century timber-framed church definitely earns its name, the Chapel in the Wilderness. The site offers sweeping views of the Staffordshire countryside. You can stand by the churchyard gate and gaze down at the village of Rushton Spencer and across to the high ridge of the Cloud on the Cheshire border. It's a tranquil spot removed from civilization, which is quite an atmospheric setting for such a morbid legend. Architecturally, St. Lawrence's is remarkable. It's one of the few timber-framed churches in Staffordshire, and the core of the structure, the nave, dates to the 1200s, built with large oak beams in a crook-frame style. In the late 1600s, this medieval wooden church was encased in sandstone and brick, and the east window bears the date 1690, and the south doorway the date 1713, marking the different phases of rebuilding. Essentially, the old wilderness chapel got a new shell, but much of the original wood framework survived inside the walls. A wooden bell turret clad in weatherboards sits on top of the roof, giving the church a quaint, rustic appearance. And inside, there are Jacobean wood furnishings, like an old pulpit and a squire's pew reserved for the local gentry. The churchyard itself has gravestones ranging back many centuries, though time and weather have knocked most of them askew or blanketed them in moss. And local historians note that the church's location was so inconvenient that in the 19th century the main population of Rushton Spencer shifted closer to a new road, leaving St. Lawrence's even more isolated. Yet this isolation preserved its antique character, and today it's a Grade 2-star listed building for its unique heritage. For those who are interested in Thomas Meakin's tale, a visit to St. Lawrence's offers not just a hunt for his grave, but also a step back in time. Now, the legend of Thomas Meakin inevitably points to the apothecary in stone as the villain of the story, a man who had both motive and means to poison the young groom. Is there any historical record of this apothecary? Researchers have dug into archives, and a likely suspect has emerged. It's a gentleman by the name of John Dickinson, with different spellings. But while we don't have a contemporary 1781 document naming the apothecary outright, later records do provide clues. The William Salt Library in Staffordshire holds a reference to an apothecary named Dickinson operating in Stone in the year 1790. This establishes that a person by that surname was practising in Stone within a decade of Thomas's death, quite possibly the same man if he was middle-aged in the 1780s. Even more telling is an entry from the Staffordshire Advertiser newspaper nearly 20 years after the incident. In an edition dated the 13th of September 1800, the paper reports an inquest at Stone, taken before J. Dickinson, gent, on the body of John Robinson, a boatman. The boatman had died in his cabin, and the verdict was natural causes, or died by visitation of God. The key detail here is the official, J. Dickinson, gent. It appears that Mr. Dickinson was acting as a quasi-coroner capacity for the inquest. The title, gent or gentleman, implies that he was a man of local importance, but not an ordained magistrate or physician. And in small communities it was not uncommon for a respected professional to oversee inquests if a coroner was not available. An apothecary would fit that role perfectly as someone with medical knowledge, but not formally a doctor. Historians believe that Dickinson is simply a variant spelling of Dickinson, and spelling was not fully standardised at the time, and newspaper typesetters often wrote names by ear. So the coincidence of a Dickinson in 1790 and a J. Dickinson in 1800, both in Stone, strongly suggests that this is the same individual, and likely the apothecary who employed Thomas Meakin. If John Dickinson was indeed the apothecary in question, what became of him? By 1800 the newspaper describes him as a gent, which could mean he was semi-retired or at least a man of leisure by then, called upon for civic duties like inquests. He was evidently never publicly accused or punished for anything related to Thomas. In fact, there's no sources for anything that really link him to the Meakin affair, which is not surprising if the matter was hushed up. It's also interesting to note that Reverend Stebbing Shaw, who was a prominent historian of Staffordshire and a native of Stone, published his History and Antiquities of Staffordshire in 1802, with no mention of Thomas Meakin's death. Now, Shaw was born in 1762, so he would have only been a couple of years younger than Thomas, and lived in Stone all his youth. Yet either he never heard of the incident, or deemed it too sensitive or scurrilous to include. The omission might suggest that by the early 19th century, the story was deliberately kept quiet in polite society, even if it survived in local folklore. So the apothecary, Dickinson, if guilty, had effectively got away with the perfect crime. He had the knowledge to administer a life-threatening potion, and the authority to declare the victim dead, thereby avoiding suspicion of everything. And now, of course, without direct evidence, we cannot conclusively convict him. What we do have is a mixture of circumstantial evidence and legend. The motive would be his father's disapproval, the method, poisoning, turning him into like a coma, death-like state, and the opportunity, and the power to certify death and discourage investigation. They do all point to the apothecary. The villagers certainly believed that Thomas had been wronged. His epitaph calls out wicked men, and in their eyes, justice was never served. John Dickinson appears in records as late as 1800, and was obviously still respected in Stone, which would not have been the case if he had been publicly suspected of a murder. And in the end, the apothecary lived out his days under no legal cloud, while Thomas Meakin's fate became an enduring cautionary tale whispered through the generations. In stepping back from the individuals involved, it is useful to frame the Thomas Meakin saga in the context of the times. The early 1780s in England, and in Staffordshire in particular, this was a period of transition in so many ways. The Industrial Revolution was in its early stages. Factories and canals were beginning to reshape the landscape, yet traditional structures of society still held sway, especially in rural areas. Rushton Spencer in the 1780s was a backwater in the Staffordshire moorlands. It had no large industry. Farming was the mainstay. However, Its proximity to the Cheshire border meant that influences from that county's silk and button trade trickled in. Many families around the Leek and Macclesfield area engaged in cottage industries like sewing buttons or weaving silk ribbons to supplement the farm's income. And there was also a well-known button-making trade in nearby Macclesfield that employed peddlers who travelled from village to village. Such economic activities gave young men like Thomas alternatives to ploughing fields. They could take a trip to the town and start a trade and not be entirely stepping into the unknown. Stone, by contrast, was a thriving coach stop and market centre, and in the 1770s the Trent and Mersey Canal opened, bringing heavy cargo barges through the canal's wharves. And this boosted Stone's commerce significantly, as goods like pottery from Stoke-on-Trent and salt from Cheshire passed through. Stone also sat on the main line from London to the northwest, meaning stagecoaches and wagons passed daily. The town had several inns, stables and blacksmiths, and of course breweries. John Jule's Brewery was established in Stone around this era. Jules began brewing in 1780, which continued the town's ale brewing tradition. So in the early 1780s, Stone was humming with economic activity. Employment could be found in hospitality, transport, brewing and crafts. Socially, the class divide was pronounced. A country boy like Thomas coming into a genteel household would know his place as a servant, but he would also see firsthand the lifestyle of the higher classes. The apothecary would likely have mingled with Stone's elite, perhaps dining with the local gentry and attending assemblies, while his servants toiled behind the scenes. Any notion of a romance between a servant and a master's daughter would have been scandalous. Marrying beneath one's station was virtually unthinkable in that era for a professional's daughter. And the story of Thomas and the apothecary's daughter fits into a classic 18th century trope, the ill-fated cross-class romance, often ended in tragedy, which was a theme found in many ballads and literature of the time. Medicine in the 1780s was also in a state of flux. Scientific understanding of poisons, for instance, lagged behind their availability. It was not until the 19th century that reliable tests for toxins like arsenic were developed, and that meant if someone wanted to commit murder by poisoning in 1781, it was disturbingly easy to do so and get away with it, especially if you were the local medical authority. Cases of accidental live burial were also a real fear in that era. There are recorded instances of people being mistakenly buried whilst in comas or suffering from diseases like cholera that could mimic death. This fear gave rise to designs for safety coffins in the 18th and 19th centuries, equipped with bells or flags to signal if a person awoke underground. Thomas's story taps into that very real contemporary anxiety about being buried alive, and it's one reason the tale spread and persisted. It was not viewed as impossible. People knew it could happen. Today, the tale of Thomas Meakin stands at that hazy intersection of history and folklore. On one hand, the core events are documented. Thomas Meakin existed, he died and was buried in 1781, and a year later he was dug up and reburied in Rushton Spencer. The parish registers verify this much. On the other hand, the cause of his death and the dramatic embellishments, so the pony, the romance, have come down to us through oral tradition and local storytellers, rather than official records. And as one modern historian put it, Thomas Meakin has become part man, part legend. The facts that do survive leave tantalising gaps filled in by conjecture. Was he truly poisoned? Could it have been a natural fit? Who exactly ordered the exhumation? Was it his friends or his family? What became of the apothecary's daughter? The legend invites us to ponder these questions, but the answers we'll probably never get. What is clear is that the community in Rushton Spencer never forgot Thomas's fate. By inscribing their suspicions in stone on his grave, they ensured that future generations would ask, what happened to this young man? And in that sense, Thomas Meakin's grave is not just a memorial, but a piece of storytelling. It's an 18th century cold case, hinted in a few carved lines and phrases for those curious enough to decipher them. Local history enthusiasts continue to be drawn to the story, and it's been recounted in blogs, walking guides, and even on social media, often under headlines like Buried Alive or Staffordshire's Most Infamous Burial. And yeah, standing in the secluded churchyard of St Lawrence's, with the wind whispering through the yew branches, it's hard not to feel a shiver when you finally find that lone west-facing headstone. In the broader scope of Staffordshire history, Thomas's legend is a reminder of the fragility of life and past times, and the imperfections of historical record. How many other curious incidents went unreported, or were quietly managed in small communities? The Meakin story only survived because it was so dramatic that people retold it, and because a physical monument anchors it in collective memory. It also serves as a cautionary tale about power and justice, a warning that those in privileged positions, like an 18th century apothecary, could, in effect, get away with murder. And as of today, Thomas Meakin rests in peace atop the gentle hill in Rushton Spencer, and the ghost that people once feared has long since faded into legend. Visitors to St Lawrence's Church can pay respects at his graveside and reflect on a life cut short. And whether you believe he was truly buried alive by a villain, or that it was just a tragic accident, the emotional truth of the story endures. It's a story of love, jealousy, untimely death, the devotion of friends and a pony who would not let the truth stay buried. And in the annals of local lore, Thomas Meakin's tale remains one of North Staffordshire's most haunting legends, a young man who died twice and whose story refuses to die. So thank you very much for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. If you do decide to go and visit St Lawrence's Church, be aware it is still a working church. The graveyard does have more modern graves in there as well, so if you do go and pay your respects, please be quiet. It is on a public footpath. There are some lovely walks around there, and there's a really nice pub in the village as well called the Staffordshire Knot. So I hope you've enjoyed this story, and I hope you go out and visit this church because it's absolutely beautiful. There are some photos and a video on my website if you'd like to have a look at it if you can't visit it, and that's at www.theredhairedstokey.co.uk. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter so you don't miss any podcasts, videos or articles. But thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.